And now I would like to introduce our second speaker of the day, Marta Poe. She will deliver more about policy, how to write a policy paper, and who can be seen to help with the policy paper. Marta is a fourth-year Doctor of Pharmacy student at VCU School of Pharmacy in Richmond, VA, USA. She currently serves as the policy coordinator for IPSF. After graduation, she hopes to work in a global public health and community pharmacy. So I would like to thank you for your participation, Martha, and thank you for accepting our invitation. So now the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for coming today. I really appreciate the invitation. And like she said, I'm going to be talking about kind of what is policy and how to write policy papers. Just a quick note about the slides. I just wanted to give credit. So several of these slides in here came from various members of IPSF. They've kind of been passed down over time. And I felt it was only right to kind of give them kudos for that. Okay, so what is policy? So essentially, it's a set of ideas or plans that we use to help us make decisions. It's like a system that we have in place so that when a new issue comes up or we have some kind of problem that we need to solve, we have a set of guiding principles that tells us, how we're going to approach the problem and what kind of outcomes we're actually trying to achieve. So essentially, another way of looking at it is it's a stance. So you're answering the question, what do we believe about this subject? Why do we believe what we do about this subject? And how do we think the issue should be addressed? And obviously our goal here is to make change happen. Pharmacy as a profession, pharmaceutical sciences has changed dramatically over the years as our roles have developed, and we've seen the profession grow in various ways and scope of practice change. And so policy is a big part of this, making sure that things don't stay the same and that we are still serving patients and taking care of people the best possible way that we can. So out with the old way and with the new. So how do we actually make this happen? Well, the first thing we're going to do is identify some kind of issue. So one example we might think of is we think that we're not getting enough experiential education in our curriculum. So we feel like we're spending all our time with our nose in the books, but we're not actually getting to, work in a pharmacy or see patients. So let's say we identify that as our problem. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to think about who actually has the power to change this thing that we want to change. So let's say we're wanting to go, we only have 10 hours per semester, I'm just making up numbers, and we want to increase it to 20. So who actually has the power to do that? So we're going to do a stakeholder analysis and really think to ourselves, is it our professors? Is it the leadership at the school, someone in administration? Is it, an accreditation board for the university? So we really think, who do we need to impact? Once we've done that, we think about all the players that contribute to the issue we're trying to work on. Then we want to carry out research and collect data and really think to ourselves, what is actually going to matter to these stakeholders? How can we convince them that we need those extra hours? What evidence do we have to show that we need those extra hours? And then once we do that, excuse me, we're going to move across the diagram and actually start generating policy recommendations. So this is the part where we actually say, you make a statement. This is what we think should be done. This is how we think it should be done. We think that these extra hours could be added to the schedule in this particular way. And so once we've come up with that, we've done our research and we've generated our policy recommendations, that's when we bring it before the stakeholders and we go to our professors and the leadership and we say, look, we did all this research. We can see that we'd benefit from more hours. This is why, this is how we should do it. Will you help us do it? And we try to convince them. And hopefully in that process, we end up influencing their decisions. And this is kind of, that was just like a little example, but this is essentially the same thing that IPSF does on a global level. We're seeing an issue that's not being talked about. We're thinking about the member organizations around the world, the different governments, the NGOs, figuring out their priorities, doing a bunch of research on the project, coming up with our own theories on how it should be approached. And then we're presenting it at things like the World Health Assembly and hopefully actually influencing those decisions globally. So this diagram really, it works on the smallest scale and it also works on the largest scale. So types of policy interventions, I just wanted to bring this up. So there are a whole bunch of different papers that you can write. Probably the ones that we most commonly do is like policy statement or position paper. However, IPSF has written all of these at some point. I won't go over all of the things, all the different types. Some of them are very nuanced. Some of them, for example, the position paper contains a call to action. So these pieces are kind of interchangeable and mixed in different ways. But if you want more details, the IPSF Policy 101 booklet is a great resource for that. And I'll make sure that we send out a PDF of that so you all will have it. All right, so I just want to go over kind of the steps of publishing a policy paper. And these steps, they make sense no matter what kind of paper it is, no matter who is writing the paper or who you are presenting it to. So this is just a general overview of how you're going to take your ideas and your opinions on what should be changed and melt them down into one compact paper that says what you are trying to accomplish. So the first thing we're going to do is establish some main priorities. And to do this, you really have to do a lot of brainstorming sometimes. There might be a problem that's very, very obvious. It's in your face, like COVID-19 pandemic. Everyone's talking about it. Everyone needs to do something right now. But it might be more subtle too. There might be something where you're thinking, where could pharmacy students be useful that we've never been useful before? What's something that isn't even considered something that we do, but we would be great at doing it. And therefore, we should argue that this needs to be added to the scope of practice for pharmacists and pharmaceutical scientists. And then also just thinking, how do you think the profession of pharmacy should be changed? Or how do you think the healthcare system in your country should be changed? Really, I guess the point I'm trying to bring across is that there are no limits to what you want to write about in policy. You should never look at it and be like, oh, that's too big of a problem, or, we really, there's nothing we can do. And you really want to get away from that mindset and just be brave enough to consider any issue that you see or any way that you think things could be better. Maybe things have been done the same way for 30 years because somebody decided it worked 30 years ago. Doesn't mean it works today. So yeah, establishing priorities. And if you're doing this as a group, you really want to get together and brainstorm and see, sometimes your classmates and your peers will come up with brilliant ideas you never would have thought of. But it helps to have those discussions and see, what really matters to the group, what matters to our country, what matters to our profession. So the next step, once you've chosen that subject, is to conduct your research. And that will allow you to actually go ahead and draft your initial statement or paper, whatever form of policy paper. So again, when you choose a subject, you're going to identify the root causes of the issue within your country or region, or whatever level of scope your policy that you're writing has. This could be something even as small as something just within your school specifically, or it could be in a specific community that lives, near your university, or it could be something more like IPSF where it's, the entire world. So kind of, figuring out what is going on in your particular area that you're working on is really important, because when you're looking at an issue, a lot of times the priorities in the United States may be completely different than the priorities in Mexico. You need to figure out what the community needs, how the issue, what are the causes of the issue within your specific country, etc. And so by doing that, you can really figure out the target groups to address that will make the most impact. This is kind of a two-sided point where, if you might establish the target groups that you need to influence, more like the stakeholders, but you might also think about, let's say you're trying to start a diabetes management program, which groups of people would benefit from this the most, which are most in need of a pharmacist help with their diabetes management. And then, of course, you want to identify those policymakers and people that are actually going to let you implement what you're trying to do, whether that is influencing their decisions and getting them to do something different, or if you're wanting to start some kind of a program, who's going to allow you to do it, who's going to give you the licensure and the green light to go ahead with it. So yeah, you definitely want to really do your research and think about every way that someone might say, oh no, you can't do that. You want to already have an answer in your head where you've looked at it and you've already considered that. And that will help you know whether or not this is something you want to pursue as well. And then just a reminder, when you're doing research on a particular subject, you want to make sure you're using valid resources. So I've just listed a few here that are, considered sources that you can consider peer-reviewed and authoritative. These are a few, if you've never checked them out, certainly PubMed and the CDC, World Health Organization, and FIP, those are probably my four most favorite things to look for research on. If I'm starting with a subject and I have no idea anything about it, these are great places to start where you can get an overview of your subject you're trying to work on. All right, our next step would be to obtain feedback from your members that you're writing these policy statements with. And not all of them are written in a group, but a lot of times policy papers are written at least on the member organization level. And it's really important that you gain feedback once you've written a draft and make sure that it actually says what your group wanted it to say in the first place. Because a lot of times, you're getting together and you're discussing and you're picking a subject, but then, one person is actually sitting down to write the initial draft. And so you want to make sure that this draft keeps coming back to the whole group and, being emailed out and giving people the chance to comment on it. Because what you really don't want is for it to be published and then someone says, well, I really thought we were going to talk about this, or I really thought this was our priority. So it's very, very important to make sure you keep circling back and allowing people to give feedback on this statement or paper or draft that you've written. All right, and then publishing your paper. So this can be done in a number of different places. What you really have to ask yourself is who needs to see it? For example, in IPSF, sometimes we're actually reading it to the World Health Assembly. It's a very big group. But if you're trying to influence people, in your school or in your town, it might look very different on where it needs to go. Maybe that's the local newspaper. Maybe that's an online forum. Maybe that's flyers that you hand out to your professors. You really think about, like I said, who needs to see it, and go from there on making a decision. And the last step really delves a bit more into kind of the stuff that Sam already talked about earlier, where you're empowering your members to advocate for themselves and the profession. So really, when it comes to this, let's say that you've come all this way, you've decided you need more experiential hours, you've figured out that the professors are the ones you need to talk to, you've tried to convince them, you've written your paper, you've handed it out to them, but you don't want to keep doing this alone. You want to convince your entire school that they too should go to the professors and say, I really think we need more experiential hours. And so if you want to do this, it really helps if you can empower the entire school or your entire organization or the entirety of IPSF by giving them tools where they can do this themselves. They don't have to start at that very, very early step of brainstorming and doing basic research. You can give them things that help them get going faster, whether that be like workshops or toolkits, or the IPSF Policy Booklet 101. They're basically, the sky's the limit. You just think about what you actually see people needing. And you can also poll people and try to figure out, what kinds of tools do you need? I recently had the opportunity on one of my rotations. I had my professor was actually helping write like a toolkit for some expansion of practice, because we had a really exciting opportunity where pharmacists were actually prescribing at the community pharmacy here in the state of Virginia, but they found that a lot of pharmacists weren't doing it. And so they had to poll them and say, what are the barriers to this? And it turned out a lot of them just felt like they didn't have the time to sit down and make the paperwork that was needed for filing. And so they were able to, do that survey and figure that out, and then provide those forms and paperwork to actually grow that expansion of practice. So one thing I really want to emphasize, and this is so important anytime that you are writing any kind of policy, going back to it, policy is the concepts. It's really the written component of the changes you want to see. And so anytime you're writing this, you really want to think about, the words that you're writing initially. What action are they actually leading to? Because it's very easy to make the mistake of saying, I want to expand the pharmacist's role in hypertension management. And you're not stopping to think, what outcome are we actually trying to see here? And so when you're writing policy, you really want to think about the words that I'm writing. What kind of impact are they having? Are they producing the action at the end that we're hoping for? Are they just raising awareness, which sometimes that's all you can do on some subjects for the time? But yeah, just always think about, the words that you write in your paper ultimately could become reality. And so you want to make sure that, once your paper that is written, the tools that are made to help people advocate for this, and then that advocacy is actually bringing about the change that was your goal in the first place. So just something very important to think about. One thing that I wanted to bring up is that a lot of people think that in order to do policy, you've got to be good at writing. And you definitely need a good writer on your team. However, there are so many other ways to contribute to policy. And this slide has a lot of, more advocacy type stuff on it as well. But even just, contributing to the discussion about the subject, bringing new ideas, sharing your local perspective. I'm from a really small rural town. And when I meet with my friends that are from the city to talk about health problems, we often have very different ideas of where we need to focus. And so there's always something that you can contribute that nobody else can, whether that's your unique ideas or your unique perspective. So just something to think about. Never feel like, oh, my writing skills aren't that great. Spent 8 years in school studying just chemistry and math, as a lot of us have. But like I said, there are so many other ways that you can, show up and support policy. And so, yeah, that brings me to a really important point, who can write policy papers? And I just want to emphasize this because the way I set up the presentation, it's mostly as if I'm talking about member organizations or IPSF, as those are usually the people that, it's usually the kind of groupings we have. But I also just want to emphasize that anyone can write a policy paper. You could even write one completely by yourself. I highly recommend getting your friends together, getting your classmates together, and, making sure everyone, has someone checking their ideas behind them so you can get a good discussion going. But never feel like you need to have a specific group or even be doing something under a specific organization. You don't have to only do policy on the types of things that IPSF talks about. There might be something in your area that's just completely unique that IPSF would never think of as a global organization. And so keep that in mind. You can do this with any group size, whether that's an individual or a huge, huge organization or government. And kind of going back to that same point I already said, don't wait for someone else to talk about an issue for you. I always had my one professor, she always says, if you don't have a seat at the table, you might be the meal. Meaning like you have to think for yourself and really think about what you want to change and don't count on someone else to bring it up. If there's something you think should be done, don't wait for IPSF leadership, bring it up on your own, get that rolling because we are ultimately, we are the future of pharmacy, and we don't, as students, we don't have all the power. A lot of times it feels like we can't do a ton, but we really can have a big impact. And then just to make sure that we send out the link for the policy booklet 101. This is extremely helpful. I feel very fortunate that I joined IPSF after this was published because it has helped a lot.
Okay, Marta, do you have any internet connection problems or is it just me?
I don't know. It like dropped entirely. And then it just came right back automatically. Okay. So I do now. Okay, we'll hope for the best. Yeah, so definitely, look around and see what other people are doing. Don't be afraid to email the president of another member organization and say, hey, I saw you did some work on this. How can, do you have any tips on how I can approach this? All right. And then also, I already brought this up earlier, but always seek feedback if you're doing this as a group. And I encourage you to do this even if you're doing it on your own. it's always good to hear somebody else's thoughts. Because like I said, the words that you write can turn into actions. And so you want to think about the consequences. It might seem like a good idea to expand the number of experiential hours, but what if those hours, take away from something else? What if because you added them, you had to give up a class on a given subject that was really important? So I really encourage you to seek feedback from other people and see if they've thought of something you haven't. And I mean, this is important everywhere in life, but definitely, be ready to learn during the process. It's really hard sometimes trying to write something that's going to convince somebody to change the way something's been done for 100 years, and so you be ready to fail a few times. It's really tough actually getting out there and trying to change people's minds. And so I think it's important to remember that if something doesn't work, then be ready to pivot and to come up with another way to approach it. And then this is just a note I put in there. If you start doing policy work, like at your member organization, for example, absolutely create a transition document for the next people who come along. This is just so helpful so that the work can be picked up and carried on by the next set of students, and they're not starting from scratch again. So probably the number one point I want to make with this is that the world we live in now is a product of the policy and advocacy of students and professionals that came before us. Never, ever forget that, because like I said, sometimes we sell ourselves short. We think, we're just students. But you know what? In 10 years, we won't be just students. And even now, we have a lot of influence, and that influence will only grow as we move through our careers. So don't be afraid to, step up to the plate and really push the envelope on how our profession is being shaped, how it is, how things are impacted over time by this policy that we do. Just something to really keep in mind, because the profession would not be where it is today if it had not been for students just like us, 20, 30, 100 years ago. And so that really has to make you think, what mark are we leaving on the profession? Are we the generation that completely rethinks the way pharmacy and pharmaceutical sciences works? Are we the generation that's going to see the scope of practice expand, et cetera, et cetera? And that is all the slides I had. Does anyone have any questions for me? Or even if you don't have.
Okay, thank you very much, Marta, for your inspiring words and for this amazing presentation. I really enjoyed listening it. And if you have any questions to Marta, you can type into the chat box, or you can type I and take the word, or you can raise your hand. And